vulnerabilities is important, but what is being done by your organization to take action to mitigate or reduce our contributions of emissions? It may not be in your bailiwick.
Yes, but in terms of vulnerabilities to climate change, like I said, we're getting a project that is called the Mobility Connectivity Study, but it has a component of the resiliency of our roads, because it's mainly for transportation. Because in a major storm, if not all the people, unfortunately, not all the people evacuate and leave, and also if everybody leaves, when you gotta come back, you gotta make sure that your bridges, your roads are in optimal conditions. So this one will look at the critical access roads and what can prevent that in an emergency. If there's a bridge, analyze that bridge and see if the bridge might get washed away. So all that transportation component is included there. And I know that our facilities manager, we're gonna be including now charging stations in all the buildings, which I'm thrilled because I own an electric car and we have only 2 at City Hall, so. But now all the buildings, the new buildings that the city own and it's gonna be building in the future, like the utilities is the new building, the public works in the future, we'll have another one, we'll require that, and we're looking to getting more people buy into the electric car. I'm already sold on that one, so.
Could you pass that then to Elizabeth?
I'm going to be very brief on this one. We're also heavy into ride sharing. SCAP has created a park and ride at our city hall, so that will help reduce emissions. We are also putting in bike lanes, encouraging biking throughout the city. So that hopefully will help out some. And I also have passed claim to a hybrid car myself too.
Thank you. Molly?
I don't really have a lot to do. I'm in the transportation department, but that's the different side of the house. So I will defer this question to Lee Hayes.
Okay. You want to bypass this as far as contributions to emissions issue, what you're doing, or?
I can pick this one up just real briefly. Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to make sure I wasn't going ahead of someone else.
Okay.
So I mentioned nature-based climate solutions earlier. That I would say is the main thing that the estuary program's been working on in terms of habitat restoration, and it's simply planting native plants that take up carbon dioxide and sequester it in the soil. So it's really more about reducing the amount of carbon dioxide that's already in the atmosphere versus, the question was about reducing the emissions that we're making now. But I also think there is a role to talk about, along with carbon dioxide emissions from cars. When we burn fossil fuels, it also makes emissions of things called nitrous oxides, which when they get into water bodies can contribute to things like algal blooms. So fossil fuel burning, it's not just about greenhouse gases that make the earth warmer, it's also about the way that those gases interact with our water bodies.
Okay, so I mentioned that Sarasota County does most of our work on the mitigation side. So some of the things that we do, a lot of education related to energy efficiency, renewable energy, and come and talk to any of your homeowners associations that are interested in any of those topics. Our Sustainable Communities Workshop is an all-day great event. November 14th, there's postcards over there if you're interested. We have a lot of topics related to that there. We have a couple incentive programs I want to make sure people are aware of. We have a green building fast track program for the private sector that builds green. And we also have rebates for a select group of businesses that install electric vehicle charging stations. We recently adopted a program for property assessed clean energy, which allows property owners to finance energy and hurricane improvements through an assessment on their property taxes. But the things I'm most proud of are related to energy efficiency. We have an energy upgrade program that's been in place for several years, educating residents on what they can do to be more energy and water efficient in their own homes. We've reached nearly 2,000 households with energy saving kits. And we estimate that we're saving almost 3,000 megawatts of energy, megawatt hours of energy annually through those households. We recently added a volunteer component. One of our volunteers is here today, and that they go into our affordable housing units and help the low-income residents save energy through direct installs of these items. And then we've just recently partnered with City of Sarasota to effect a program related to energy efficiency for nonprofits. So that's my biggest focus recently, and I'm really excited about some of the impacts.
Okay, I'll be brief, but really a lot of the City of Sarasota's initiatives fall under what Lynn talked about earlier, the Ready for 100 initiative, when our city commission set a target for 100% renewable energy community-wide by 2045, and then for city operations, 100% by 2030, and a short-term goal for city operations of 50% by 2024. And so that really scared me when they set that target, because I thought, how feasible is this? And but what it did is it really set the direction, and it set the vision for us to go do a lot of planning and to devote our to devote my time to try to figure it out and work with community organizations on trying to figure it out. So we facilitated a year-long, every other month of planning meetings and workshops to gather ideas from the community, to relay what data we had available for where we were at now for amount of renewable energy, and to prioritize strategies that focused first on energy efficiency. And it was a very grassroots, I think it still is a very grassroots type of initiative, and it's something that we're very proud of. We've also pre-registered for FPL's new Solar Together program for city operations, and if you're not familiar with that, it's a new opportunity where 100% of our city operations could be powered through a solar farm, essentially, from FPL. And we would actually start saving money on city bills and get a credit back on our bills starting on year 5. And then the Partners for Green Places is really a lot of time lately, which is an exciting collaboration to help nonprofits who have a lot of barriers to pursuing energy efficiency and renewable energy, and it's providing grant funding and technical assistance to help them do that. So,
Okay, keep the microphone. Water quality has been front and center in our community over the last year. How does water quality relate to climate change locally?
yeah, that's a really good one. There's a few things I wanted to mention on this. It's water quality is not my specialty in terms of my technical specialty. So, I won't pretend to speak as closely as Elizabeth, Wong, and others on the topic, but there is a lot of science that's starting to indicate that warmer waters, which are projected for the future, will impact, coupled with nutrients, will impact water quality and algae blooms. And so warmer waters, it just shows that we need to do more to reduce our emissions. And then also around the transportation emissions that Darcy was saying yesterday, I think, or saying earlier, it's been a long day. That transportation emissions from our tailpipes are one of the few local emissions. If you think of energy emissions that are usually really being released regionally or somewhere else from a power plant, tailpipe emissions are hyper-local emissions that interact very closely with our water bodies. And so everything that we can do for transportation emissions, I do think is an important part of the water quality discussion, although it's not as intuitive. And of course, the City of Sarasota has an advanced wastewater treatment facility, and so that has a lot of detail in it to the degree of which we treat our wastewater and how that interacts with water quality as well.
Okay, so I think they've both said much of what I was going to say on this about atmospheric deposition, which means that you, in how much you drive and how much energy you use actually from the power plants that sometimes come downwind, you can make a difference in water quality, but also be affecting your carbon emissions, which is great. And then there's also concerns about the effect of water temperature on algal blooms and the carbon dioxide emissions affecting ocean acidification. So all those are water related. The thing I will mention that maybe someone else wouldn't is you, our voters, have chosen to tax yourselves to protect our natural areas through our environmentally sensitive lands program, and that actually is sequestering tremendous amounts of carbon in our natural areas and also providing a water quality benefit by keeping that water on the ground and not sending it out to the Gulf through some impervious areas. So I think that's something that's often overlooked as a climate benefit itself.
No, I've got it.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Some really, really good points so far on this, about temperature increases in waters, having impacts on algae blooms and harmful algal blooms. What I want to mention as well is how when we get more rainfall, that can have real stresses on our infrastructure. And I won't talk about stormwater. I'm going to leave the stormwater alone. But with wastewater infrastructure, it can be a huge stressor. And, when we get a lot of rain, it can get into our wastewater systems and overwhelm the capacity that they have to treat that water. So I know that's a really big priority for our local utility systems, is trying to upgrade those capacities to make sure in those events, which are getting more and more frequent, that we're able to treat all of that water and make sure it doesn't get into our water bodies with excess nutrients in it that can lead to these harmful algae blooms. So that's, I think, a really important piece of climate change and water quality. So a couple of other things with increased water temperatures, it has direct impacts on the organisms that live in the water, of course. So we're expecting, and water temperature is a part of water quality. It's not just clarity. It's also about how that water temperature makes a home for the organisms in that water. So we may start seeing range shifts of the things that live in the water. So that could mean things like exotic invasive species that are coming to our area, but it could also mean things that are living further south from us may start becoming more frequent in this area. So that's another issue. And then lastly, I just want to mention that with water quality in the bays, the algae that you get when you get the increased nutrients in the water, it's not always super visible. So sometimes we'll get these harmful algae blooms that are really visible, and we get a lot of calls about what's going on in the water. But sometimes those increased nutrients can just lead to lower what we call water clarity in the bay, which is how far light can penetrate down to the bottom of the bay. And so when we get increased nutrients, which may become more frequent with increased rainfall, that water clarity may go down, which can have an impact on the seagrasses that are living on the bottom of our bays. They cover about half of the bottom of our bays. They're flowering plants, and they have a huge role in supporting the fish and other wildlife that live in our bays. So, if we start seeing declines in those seagrasses, it can have impacts on our other wildlife as well. So, we're wanting to try to keep an eye on how the rainfall patterns that we're having, both with climate change and natural patterns, are impacting the amount of nutrients that are getting into our system.
CONA has also been following this topic with the water keepers, and I've attended 2 seminars that they presented, the Calusa water keepers. And one of the things that you need to pay attention to is not just red tide. Blue-green algae is now becoming suspect for having much more profound effects on human health. And you need to pay attention to this, because it doesn't create the adverse effects that red tide does, of stinging eyes and headaches and driving you away. It's there where you are, and you're not so much aware of it. So stay tuned to that issue and watch as this develops.
Thank you. We really should have done rock, paper, scissors in the parking lot to figure out what we were going to talk about, so we don't steal each other's ideas, Darcy. So Darcy, you're such an evil. So how does water quality relate to climate change locally? So as you know, you all mentioned it makes everything, we used to have a rain pattern every summer, and we could set your watch by it. If it would rain by 2 o'clock, and so we don't have that anymore. It's kind of changed, and that's a climate change thing. Also, it just puts the in everything. It's hotter, it's wetter, it's drier, it's yuckier, and so a lot of the things we plan for, maybe Elizabeth will touch on that, is a lot of things that we plan for in our development, and how we assume we can make changes for water quality benefits that may be gone because we're in the we're hotter, we're wetter, we're drier, and we can't make our assumptions anymore. Darcy, you stole this from me, but I'll say it again.
You say it better.
Okay, I'll say it better. Thank you. And so one of the things you touched on was the freshwater influence, and we have more rain events and more freshwater, and freshwater is a pollutant in marine systems. It can drive our estuaries to a more freshwater ecosystem where we don't have the important estuary species that come up and make our place an incredible place to live. Also, rainwater's hot, and that changes the temperatures of our ponds, our stormwater ponds. So it's a petri dish 10 months out of the year instead of 8 months out of the year. And it just, our climate here is so wonderful and vivacious and warm. We have a lot of wonderful things that happen, but we used to have maybe a quiet period when things got a little cooler. We can sit back. We don't have to mow our lawns anymore. Things take a little bit of a siesta, and we don't have that anymore. So we are 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We don't have that natural change in our seasons so much anymore. So to help Mother Nature reset, and that's some of the things that we have to deal with. And once again, Darcy touched on this: is if we give nature a chance, we can figure it out. And so that's how water quality is changing with climate change, and making things a little bit more complex and evergreen, as opposed to having a little bit of quiet time.
Elizabeth, how does water quality relate to climate change locally?
I can talk all night on water quality. I won't. One thing I want to say that we do in Northport, which is related to water quality, is that we've taken a lot more harder look at preserving wetlands in Northport. Long ago, talking about 20 years ago, there's a bit of a Wild West where single family homes just built and destroy wetlands and nobody really looked at it. But within the last couple of years, we have trained our building department reviews zoning staff. When they get a permit, they look at whether there's going to be a wetland or not on that single family lot. We look at developments a lot more closely, and I do that. And I'm happy to report that almost all of the developers have tried not to kill wetlands, because wetlands do provide a treatment value for the water quality. And it also is green areas, so that's hot. Has anybody ever seen dead fish from hot water? I saw about a month ago, there was a fish kill in Northport, and when I went to investigate, the water was very hot, very stagnant, no rain, hot, and with just even a little bit of nutrients, sucks all the oxygen out of the water, and it's sad to see fish gasping for oxygen. Is it a good time to talk about water quality and fertilizing what we've done? Or is that?
Well, this is just how water quality relates to climate change locally. We'll be able to come back to that.
Okay.
Okay. No, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
We might as well keep it going back and forth
Okay.
smoothly.
Okay, I really have nothing further to add to this, but living, for the folks who live in the town of Longboat Key, living on a barrier island, water quality is quality of life. And so it's very important to have good water quality, especially when you live on a barrier island. So, I'm not a scientist, and I have no further comments.
Okay, Jerry?
With water quality, beside what Elizabeth mentioned, I know that the city of Northport has a lot of septic tanks, and I heard a scientist, I'm not a scientist in that realm, from Molt Marine Laboratory talking about the impact of wastewater from humans, and that was last year during the red tide. And she mentioned that, a lot of times people complain poor Lake Okeechobee is the culprit of everything. And she mentioned that from Lake Okeechobee until it gets to the Fort Myers area, they did some testing at the exit of Lake Okeechobee and at the estuary, and the readings were very different. And she said that Lake Okeechobee was not the main culprit. It contributed, but not much. So our utilities department have a plan of installing new sanitary sewers so we can take out all this septic tanks. And also in Northport, like I said, a lot of roads flood during major rain events, and guess what? Those septic tanks, although they're designed to be above the flood stage, now we're seeing that floods keep going high and high, and now we're seeing houses getting higher and higher. Pretty much, pretty soon they're gonna be almost like in stilts in city of Northport. When I first started working, I was driving, I was like, why I felt like the road was sunk, and the houses were very high, and that's what I learned, that it was because of the septic tanks. They gotta be out. So, and I noticed from our utilities department that sanitary sewer is very, very, very expensive. And I know that we have competing, the cities and municipalities, we have competing priorities, and we gotta pick and choose. Everybody would love to have an open checkbook. And I think that this one is one part that more funds should be in, and their grants, and I know that our utilities department is looking into that. And it's a slow process and it's expensive, but at least they're heading in the right direction.
Let's go to Carolyn. We often hear about sea level rise, but what other concerns related to climate change has your organization identified for our county?
Right, in the initial assessment that the town did, storm surge, rainfall, flooding, flood insurance premiums, resilience of the infrastructure and services, like roads, evacuation routes, drinking water, sewage systems, backflow, and stormwater, and then just the overall economic effects relating to real estate market, property values, and then tourism.
In 2016, we adopted new flood maps. It was amazing how much more high-risk flood zone that came to Northport that's identified. But, you know, it's better to know and be prepared for it than not knowing. We did a very extensive, detailed flood modeling of Northport, and that's 2016, November. In December this year, all of us in Sarasota County are going to see new storm surge risk maps draft represented by the consultants of FEMA. So, and I've seen the preliminary maps back in August, and they raised the flood stage another foot higher in Northport, 1 to 2 feet higher in Northport. Remember how far up from the ocean Northport is? So I feel bad for our neighbors. Those risk maps are going to affect a lot of people, but again, knowing what the risks are and preparing for it is better than not knowing.
Thank you. Yeah, flood risk was one of the things on there. You know, we update our flood models all the time, and so you know, flooding in not only coastal areas but areas you think, well, we're not on the coast, we're not going to flood, but you know, back in the day, Sarasota County did not do a really good job of identifying floodplain, and so there were a lot of homes built in floodplains. And you know, those re-examining those what they call repetitive loss areas, especially with the rain events that we had in Sarasota County. We're fortunate that we require development to be able to contain the 100-year storm event. That doesn't mean it happens every 100 years. In the summertime, it can happen every other day. But it's a certain amount of water and a certain amount of time. That's not true for a lot of communities. Manatee County does not require that. They require a smaller rain event. So, you know, we're fortunate, we're a little bit ahead of the game, but climate change sometimes means that these rain events become more frequent. You know, we may get, instead of 8 inches in a storm, you know, we've seen it already, you know, areas get 12, 14, 24 inches of rain. And, you know, if that's gonna be a normal thing that happens for climate change, we have to re-examine how we get people out. You know, how do we get them out in a hurricane or in a flooding situation? How do we mobilize? Where are our fire stations? You know, where are our hospitals? And so we have to take a look at where our important information or our infrastructure is. You know, our wastewater septic, our wastewater systems, you know, those are pump stations. They have to actively turn on and off. Are those going to be flooded when we need them to be? And if we need them somewhere else, we have to find them another place for it. So these are all the considerations that we have to plan for. A lot of times, not necessarily proactively, and what I mean by that is typically when some of these things fail or have reached their useful life, that's when we go in and do the upgrades. And so, and when we upgrade for the future, we are not gonna replace a bridge that we know is gonna be nearly underwater in 30 years at the same height. We will look at it, we will have it examined to replace it at a different elevation. So those are all the things that we consider forecasting into the future.
I want to mention ocean acidification, which is a non-sea level rise climate change related issue that we're concerned about in our oceans around the world. Ocean acidification is what it sounds like. It's when the waters get more acidic. So it has to do with the way that carbon dioxide dissociates when it's in the water. And when our oceans are getting more acidic, it can make it difficult for a lot of different organisms, specifically things that build shells. So we have a lot of things that build shells in our estuaries. We care a lot about our oyster beds, the scallops that we do have remaining, our clams. And when oceans and water gets more acidic, it can make it more difficult for those things to survive because they can't build their shells anymore. So that's one thing we're concerned about with acidification. This is actually related to sea level rise, but I haven't heard it brought up yet, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, is potential loss of coastal habitat with sea level rise. We have a lot of coastal development here, and as sea level rises, we're at risk of losing a lot of the habitat that's out in front of that development. So you can think about if there's a mangrove forest that's in front of some seawalls, as sea level rises, it can effectively drown those mangroves, and if they aren't able to move inland, they have nowhere to go. So that's going to lead to loss of some habitat, and it's also loss of public access to the waterfront if restoration isn't a priority.
Okay, so just briefly, I was gonna mention that my personal concern lately has been around extreme heat. There's a Union of Concerned Scientists study that found that in Sarasota County, our historical we've only had 5 days per year with a heat index over 105. But if we take slow action on climate change, so if we don't all come together and make a change, they predict that our county could experience 77 days that are that hot per year. It's a really big change, which is why I think focusing on mitigation is so important, because the difference in early action versus late action is really extreme.
Hayes, I was gonna say heat. So I won't add to it, but that's something that the city of Sarasota also looked at, was heat, and something that's really kind of concerning. We looked at the days over 95 degrees and looked at the data from the Bradenton Air Station, and our air temperature there since 1965 had showed just over 2 degrees increase. That's not a long time of record, but it was enough to be interesting to note, and future projections showed for us in our modeling about 50 to 60 days over 95 degrees by 2050, which really is a trigger for some public health impacts and as well. And so I think heat is really important, and then social equity as well, in terms of low-income folks, people of color, neighborhoods that are already and historically been disenfranchised, how they are able to adapt to these conditions already under the stresses that they live under. So I think that's also a big part of the conversation as well.
Okay, keep the microphone. What can neighborhoods and residents do to contribute to these efforts or to get involved?
Okay, I think this is our last question, just so everybody knows, in case y'all are watching the clock. But I think, of course, decreasing your own footprint, but I think a lot of really powerful impact is with collective action as well. So I really encourage you to, work with your businesses, with your neighborhood associations, and find out how you can collectively make impact towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions or adapting your neighborhood or your home in a collective way. And I really encourage you to show up and be engaged in political processes. I might be kicking myself for saying that in a way, but really, we have a meeting coming up on a green building program, likely on November 4th. I've been meaning to email some of y'all on November 4th, and City Commission will be talking about that, showing up to our Ready for 100 initiative to partake in the planning and the actions around that initiative will really help, kind of garner, I think, that collective action in addition to your personal impact, and take one of Lee Hayes' drawdown classes.
Okay, so just quickly, one of my favorite climate scientists is Catherine Hayhoe, and when she's asked what's the most important thing that someone can do on climate change, she says talk about it. So you're doing that tonight, good job, but what you can really do is take this back to your own neighborhoods and get them talking about it, and I'm happy to come and talk to your neighborhoods, and I think most of us on this panel would be very happy to do that and to take it down to that level and really bring this up to scale. Beyond that, we have a lot of opportunities for neighborhoods to get engaged. Our neighborhood grant program, I have the flyers that are literally hot off the presses. We have the new deadlines for those that are now available. Projects can be funded to support water quality and energy reductions in your neighborhoods. You can join Civics 101 to learn more about what our county does related to neighborhoods. And a couple more programs will be launching soon, some specifically around sustainability strategies for neighborhoods. You can learn all about that by emailing neighbor@scgov.net and get all those dates and information. And then in my office at Extension, we have a whole series of classes on homeowners association landscapes. So if you want to make a difference in your own neighborhood's landscapes, which has tremendous impact on water quality, water efficiency, and energy, we can help walk you through that and even do an on-site consultation for your homeowners association sort of common landscaped areas, so we can come out and give you advice on how to make a change.
I'll ditto that last point from Lee Hayes. Simply, plant native plants, remove exotic invasive plants, and reduce your fertilizer use. And IFAS can teach you how to do all of that, as well as some other great organizations in the community. If you live on a waterfront property and you have mangroves, especially if they're hedged mangroves, try to have a conversation